March 1945, Germany. A supply convoy had broken down outside a small farm near the town of Kaiserslautern. 17 vehicles with mechanical problems serious enough that repairs would take several days. The soldiers, roughly 80 men, were stranded with limited field rations, no shelter beyond their vehicles, and no immediate prospect of resupply. The farm's owner, a man named Georg Haller, was 64 years old. His 2 sons were dead, one on the Eastern Front in 1942, one at Stalingrad in 1943. His wife had died the previous winter. He lived alone with 2 farmhands who had stayed on despite not being paid in 4 months. He did not greet the Americans. He did not speak to them that first evening. He simply watched them try to organize themselves in his yard and went back inside. The following morning, the farmhands appeared at the edge of the convoy with bread, potatoes, and preserved vegetables, enough for 80 men. Hot coffee followed an hour later. Nobody had asked for any of this. It happened again the next morning, and the morning after that. On the 4th day, the convoy was repaired and ready to move. A sergeant went to the farmhouse door to thank Haller, who accepted without elaboration, and asked only that the soldiers close the gate behind them when they left. The sergeant included it in his after-action report as a notable incident. 3 days later, the report was on Patton's desk. Before we get into what Patton did when he read it, if you want more untold stories from World War II, hit that subscribe button. Patton read the report twice. Then he called in his quartermaster officer, a major named Dennis Howell, and asked him a specific question. What was the approximate market value in current Allied military scrip of 3 days of food for 80 men sourced from a working farm's existing stores? Georg Haller had been farming that land for 31 years by the time the American convoy broke down in his yard. He had taken over the property from his father in 1914, just before the First World War began, and had managed to hold it through the lean years of the 1920s and the Depression years of the 1930s by the kind of methodical, careful work that kept farms operating when the broader economy could not be counted on for support. His 2 sons had grown up working alongside him, and he had expected, in the ordinary way that farmers expected such things, that at least one of them would still be there when he was too old to manage the heavier work himself. The Eastern Front had taken one of them in the autumn of 1942. Stalingrad had taken the other in January 1943. He had received both notifications by letter, several weeks after each death, and had continued working the farm because stopping was not a viable alternative. The 2 farmhands who had remained through the winter despite 4 months without pay were named Karl and Oskar, both men in their 50s, both of whom had worked for Haller's father before working for Haller himself. They had stayed because the farm was where they lived, and because they could see no better option in a country where almost nothing was functioning as it was supposed to. When the American convoy appeared in the yard on that March evening, it had been Karl who had said, without particular discussion, that they should put something together for the men in the morning. Haller had not disagreed. Howell said he could have an estimate within the hour. Patton told him to make it a precise figure, not an estimate, calculated from actual commodity prices in the region rather than from standard military ration equivalents, because he wanted the payment to reflect what Haller had actually given rather than what the Army's accounting system considered equivalent. He said there was a difference between what something was worth to the Army and what it cost a man who had done the giving, and he wanted the payment to reflect the latter. Howell returned with the figure 2 hours later. Patton approved it without modification and added a second instruction. The payment was to be made in person, by an officer, not mailed through administrative channels or left with a local official. He specifically wanted Haller to receive it from someone who could explain, face-to-face and in German, why it was being delivered and who had authorized it. He also added one further specification. The officer delivering the payment was not to accept any refusal of it. If Haller declined on the grounds that he had not expected payment and did not want it, the officer was to set the envelope on Haller's kitchen table and walk out, leaving it there regardless of what Haller said about it afterward. A lieutenant named Karl Reeves, who spoke functional German from a civilian background working in import trade before the war interrupted it, was assigned the delivery. He drove to the farm 3 days after the report had first reached Patton, arriving in the early afternoon with the payment sealed in a standard military envelope and a brief written summary that Patton's aide had prepared describing the purpose of the visit and the authorization behind it. Haller opened the farmhouse door, looked at the lieutenant in his American uniform for a moment, and said nothing, waiting, Reeves explained in German, speaking carefully and without rushing, that the payment inside the envelope was for the food that had been provided to the convoy over 3 consecutive days in March, that the amount had been calculated specifically from current regional market commodity prices rather than from any standard military accounting formula, and that General Patton had personally ordered that it be delivered in this manner, in person, by an officer who could explain it properly. Haller listened to all of this without interrupting. When Reeves finished, Haller was quiet for a notably long moment, long enough that Reeves prepared himself mentally to leave the envelope on the kitchen table as instructed. Then Haller said, in German, that he had not expected to be paid for what he had done. He added that he had not fed the soldiers because he expected anything in return. He had simply done it because they had been in his yard and they had needed feeding. Reeves said he understood that completely, and that this was precisely the reason Patton had decided to make sure the payment happened regardless. Haller stood in the doorway for another moment considering this. Then he took the envelope. He held it without opening it, looked at it briefly, and then asked Reeves in a tone that carried no particular hostility and no particular warmth whether the lieutenant wanted coffee. Reeves said yes. They sat at Haller's kitchen table for approximately 20 minutes while the coffee was prepared and drunk. Haller talked, in the unhurried way of a man who did not have many visitors, about his sons, about the farm and what the war years had done to the land and the equipment, about the winter that had just finished, and whether the spring looked as though it would allow a reasonable planting season. Reeves listened carefully and responded where his German allowed him to do so naturally, which was in more places than Haller might have expected from an American officer. Neither of them addressed the war directly, or discussed what the payment in the envelope represented beyond its straightforward character as compensation for goods provided and received. When Reeves stood to leave, Haller walked him to the farmhouse door and extended his hand. Reeves shook it. Haller had not done this when the convoy sergeant had come to the door 3 days earlier to offer thanks, accepting the thanks with a brief nod and without any physical gesture of acknowledgement. Reeves noted this distinction internally without commenting on it to Haller. He reported back to his commanding officer that the delivery had been completed and that Haller had accepted the payment. In his brief verbal account of the visit, he included the detail about the handshake specifically, not because he judged it to carry any military significance whatsoever, but because it struck him as the most precise and honest single-sentence summary of how the visit had actually ended and what it had meant in practical terms to the man who had opened the door. The convoy sergeant, whose original after-action report had set the entire chain of events in motion, was a staff sergeant named William Peavy, 27 years old, from Georgia. He had included the incident in his report not because anyone had instructed him to document civilian interactions of this kind, but because it had seemed to him, in the moment he was writing up the convoy's breakdown and subsequent repair, that something had happened during those 3 days that deserved to be written down somewhere by someone who had witnessed it firsthand. He had not known when he submitted the report whether anyone senior to him would read it or act on it, or simply file it without comment. He learned what Patton had done with it 3 weeks later from Reeves, who had heard about the original report through the same administrative channel that had assigned him the delivery. Patton did not follow up on the matter publicly. He did not include it in any of his formal statements or in his own written accounts of the campaign's final weeks. It appeared in the documentary record only once as a supply officer's notation, once as Reeves' brief verbal account to his commanding officer, and once, a generation later, in a regional history of the Kaiserslautern area assembled from interviews conducted with local residents who had lived through the occupation period. That regional history noted without elaboration or particular emphasis that Georg Haller had continued farming the same property until his death in 1963 at the age of 82, that Karl and Oskar, the 2 farmhands who had prepared the food for the convoy soldiers that march, had remained with him through the post-war years, and had eventually taken over the working portions of the land as Haller aged. It noted that Haller had spoken about the American soldiers in his yard in March 1945 on several occasions to neighbors, and to the regional historian who interviewed him in the late 1950s, describing them without particular sentiment in either direction as men who had been cold, had needed feeding, and had left the gate closed when they went. He had never mentioned the payment to anyone who was later interviewed for the history. The researchers found reference to it only in the American military supply records they had requested through official channels as part of the documentary research for the project. Howell's calculation, when he returned with the precise figure as Patton had requested, had required him to contact 2 different regional supply officers and a civilian commodity assessor working with the Allied military government to establish current actual market prices for bread, potatoes, preserved vegetables, and coffee in the Kaiserslautern area as of that week. This was a more complex process than producing a standard ration equivalent, which would have been considerably faster and required no external consultation. Howell later mentioned to a colleague that the instruction to calculate from actual commodity prices rather than ration equivalents had been one of the more specific payment directives he had received during his entire time as quartermaster officer, and that it had resulted in a figure meaningfully higher than what the standard ration formula would have produced for the same quantity of food, a difference that he understood, without Patton having explained it to him, was the entire point of doing it the more complicated way. What do you think? Was Patton's insistence on precise payment the right response? Or was it an unnecessary formality, given that Haller had acted without any expectation of compensation? Let us know in the comments below. And if you want more untold stories from World War II, make sure you subscribe.